My man, Dimitri
Hi.
Lascaris. How you doing, man? You doing okay?
Little groggy. How are you doing this morning?
I am doing all
You-
right. I'm doing all right. We're just a little groggy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And just for the audience, Dimitri Lascaris, lawyer, journalist, activist, Montreal, Quebec. Dimitri runs the show Reason to Resist. Dimitri, I've been binging your content recently. Damn good show. Damn good show. Um, I guess the thing we have to talk about is the quote unquote stabilization force that the United Nations passed. They passed it in its entirety. Russia and China gave a strongly worded speech and then abstained on their veto. I've heard some people make the point of saying this is kind of like them abstaining on Libya, where it's like, hey, we're not going to get involved, even though we're going to give a strongly worded condemnation statement. I think I started the show off pointing out that I don't really care about statements anymore. We have all sorts of politicians in this country that give statements about some of anything. Donald Trump claims he's not a pedophile. I don't believe him. That's a statement for all intents and purposes. I care about what you do. And if you had the power to veto it, that's not going to war. That's not launching a missile. That's not doing anything other than saying, yeah, we think this is a horrible idea. We don't think this achieves the objectives that they're setting out to claim that this achieves. There's no two-state solution in this. The dog and pony showed that it is. And so, yeah, we're calling a veto on this. They didn't do that. They just abstained. Give me your take.
I'm going to try not to employ any obscene language, Jamal.
You're welcome to.
But
You're welcome to.
I can't find the words to express how disgusted I am by this resolution. I just can't. I mean, one of the things that just offends me in ways that I can't even express is that we are demanding as an international community through this heinous resolution that the victims of a genocide, be one that is ongoing, by the way, that the world has failed to stop for over 2 years, are being divested of their light weapons, or will be if this resolution is implemented. And the perpetrators of the genocide remain armed to the teeth with every imaginable destructive capacity known to humanity, including nuclear weapons.
Yep.
The United Nations is not even talking about disarming Israel. Israel has not only forfeited the right to have armaments, Israel has forfeited the right to exist. And just as Germany ought to have been divested of that right, so too should Israel. But Israel will continue to exist. Israel will continue to remain armed to the teeth, and Israel will remain in physical occupation for an indefinite period of time under this resolution of over 50% of the Gaza Strip, which was already, as you and I have talked about, one of the most densely populated parts of the world.
Yeah.
And this is quite apart from offending the most basic sense of human decency, it is also a violation of international law. The International Court of Justice ruled last year that Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is illegal and must end forthwith. And this resolution doesn't even accomplish that much. It is basically replacing one occupier with another. I haven't had a chance, by the way, to read the entire resolution, so I'm going on the basis of media reports, but I've read several. And doesn't require, it imposes no penalty upon Israel for failing, for example, to supply the Palestinians, those who have survived this horror, with sufficient humanitarian aid. I understand that this resolution endorses the idea of this peace board, which Trump says he's going to lead. So the resolution, if that is in fact accurate, that report, the resolution will put in charge of the Gaza Strip the person who is ultimately responsible, at least since January of this year, for the genocide.
Yep.
So this brings me to China and Russia. I think the last time you and I talked about China and Russia, which probably was the last time we spoke, I made the point that history, recent history, leads inexorably to the conclusion that The Chinese and Russian governments do care deeply about sovereignty, but really only about their own sovereignty. They don't really care at the end of the day, not enough to take meaningful action about the sovereignty of other states. And they'll do business with anybody. I recently learned, I wasn't aware of this, that we already knew, it was easily determined that China was one of the largest trading partners of Israel.
Yep.
Well, I recently learned that Russia is one of the largest suppliers of oil to Israel. And this came through a report by Oil Change International about which countries have been providing the main fuel supplies to Israel during the past 2 years. And according to Oil Change International, Russia provides a huge amount of oil through Kazakhstan. For some reason, the oil is sent to Kazakhstan. I think it might be refined in Russia, but it's coming from Russia. And then Russia on its own, separately, provides a particular type of fuel that is important to the functioning of the Israeli economy. Would they do that if they cared about international law, if they believed in the Geneva Convention, the Genocide Convention? Would they, refrain from exercising a damn veto? So basically, I'm completely convinced that Russia and China don't really care about the international legal order at all. They care only about themselves, the governments of these countries. And you may say that's perfectly legitimate. You may say that's their job. Their job is to prioritize the interests of their own people to the exclusion of all others. And if they refrain from vetoing this resolution, evidently they believe there was some benefit to their countries in so doing. I don't really give a damn. At the end of the day, they are signatories to the Genocide Convention. They are signatories to the UN Charter. They are signatories to the Geneva Conventions. No one put a gun to their heads and told them to sign those treaties, amongst others. I could name quite a few others that they're parties to that oblige them to put a stop to this. And instead, they can't even exercise their veto. I don't want to put the primary blame on them. To be clear, the people who are primarily responsible are those who are arming Israel and who are putting forward this resolution and who say they're going to send in their troops to disarm the Palestinians, the victims of this genocide, while leaving Israel armed to the teeth. They're the ones who are primarily culpable. But don't tell me that China or Russia care a damn about an effective international legal order and the treaties, the foundational humanitarian treaties that they have signed on to. We now have proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that they don't. They prioritize their own sovereignty and national interest over everything else.
Why do you think that they didn't use that veto? I mean, they went with the excuse, well, all of these vassal states, Arab vassal states, went along with it. And so even though we don't necessarily like it, for example, I was reading Russia's statement. It says, we already had the unfortunate experience of seeing solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict pushed through the United States, bringing about the opposite results of what was intended. Don't say we didn't warn you. And then they abstain. Like, that's what annoys me, right? It's this idea of, this sucks. We don't like this. This is horrible. This is going to have the opposite results of what they're saying it's going to have. However, we're not going to intervene on this at all. He continues. He says, we've had the unambiguous public statements coming out of the highest echelons of Israel's leadership stating that it is unacceptable to establish a Palestinian state. Unfortunately, these key components did not make it into the U.S. draft. It also lacks any clarity about the time frame for the transfer of Palestinian Authority of control over the Gaza and any certainty surrounding the Board of Peace, quote unquote, I'm going to put quotes in, of the International Stabilization Force, the ISF, which, according to the text of the resolution we adopted, would appear to be able to act absolutely autonomously without any regard for the position nor the opinion of Ramallah. This may entrench the separation of the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. It is reminiscent of the colonial practices of the League of Nations' British mandate for Palestine, when the opinion of the Palestinians themselves was not taken into account. All of that's true. All of that's true, right? But we abstain. And I could get the Chinese statement also, which is that radically different from the Russian statement in this case. What do you think the motivation is? Why do you think they abstain? Meaning, to make a statement like that, where you're calling out the flaws of a particular piece of bill that's going to the UN Security Council, for God's sake, And mind you, I remember when they passed the ceasefire through the UN Security Council, and the U.S. says this is a non-binding resolution. And the U.S. was like, yeah, we don't care. Let this pass. Why would they be okay with this going through?
I have no goddamn idea. I mean, I cannot imagine what they're thinking. All I can do is speculate that there's some kind of deal struck, that they got something. They got something out of something that they value in exchange for refraining from exercising this veto. Because it otherwise makes no sense to me, Jamal. I saw a report in the Israeli media that a few days ago, Vladimir Putin called the war criminal Netanyahu, and apparently he initiated the call. There's no way they didn't talk about this resolution. Of course they talked about this resolution. And something, I can only guess that there was some kind of a deal struck there, and it may have involved the Americans, and there's something that matters to the Russians in that region, maybe to the Chinese. I have no doubt also that they were being pressured by the Arab autocracies, but they know full well that Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain and all those, tyrants, their leaders are in the back pocket of Washington. They know that, and they're not exercising independent judgment, and they're not acting in the interests of the Palestinian people, or even their own people for that matter. They know all of that. So I don't think that pressure at the end of the day should have mattered much. They should have said, we can in good conscience allow this resolution to pass. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Mahmoud Abbas was pressuring the Russians and the Chinese to sign off on this. He wants Hamas to be disarmed. I don't care what he's saying publicly. He wants Hamas to be disarmed. He wants them to be removed from power, and he wants to be inserted ultimately, or his successor, into a leadership role in the Gaza Strip, in the whole of occupied Palestine, where he can then proceed to, collaborate with the occupier throughout the entirety of what remains of Palestinian territory. So maybe, I don't know, if there wasn't a secret deal, maybe they just felt they didn't want to offend all of these, local players in a region that's strategically important. But it's completely inconsistent, as I say. I just can't stress this enough, in every conceivable way with Russia's and China's obligations under core treaties of the international legal order.
Here's a question. How do they intend to disarm Hamas?
Well, this brings us to the question of implementation, right?
Right.
So although I do condemn this in the strongest possible terms, and again, I stress that I place the primary responsibility for this on Western governments, not on China and Russia. It's another question altogether whether this thing's going to be implemented. So who's going to go in there? There's been a lot of talk of, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, Egypt. Are they really going to go in there and attempt to disarm Hamas after Israel failed miserably to do so? Did they think that the Islamic Jihad and Hamas and the other resistance groups that are currently armed in the Gaza Strip are going to hand over their weapons just because they're coming from predominantly Arab or Muslim states? They've come out very clearly, again, not just before, but after the resolution was adopted, the resistance groups have said, hell, no way, we're not giving them up. So how are they going to succeed where Israel failed for over 2 years, despite having inflicted what is effectively a nuclear demolition? I mean, it looks like a nuclear, bomb went off there. I don't know that these people are that deluded that they think they're going to be able to do this. And if they attempt it, they're going to suffer serious casualties. So I remain very skeptical. Maybe at the end of the day, this is why the Chinese and the Russians, I don't know, maybe this influenced them. Maybe they thought, look, this thing's a pipe dream. So yeah, you want to try and go in there and, disarm the resistance. Give it your best shot, man. But we think you're going to fail. Maybe that was their calculus.
That was my thought too, that they looked at this and thought to themselves, good luck with that. That's going to look horribly. Oh, that's going to fail miserably. And they didn't necessarily want to stand in the way of something that they thought was already going to, as you point out, be a pipe dream. I think I had Mark on yesterday. Mark was like, yeah, I don't believe this is going to happen. Like, meaning regardless of the resolution, regardless of all of the plans and everything else, how do you plan to pull this off? How are you going to get Hamas to give up their weapons? Turkish, Indonesian, whatever other troops that effectively go in, how do you expect, what are you going to do? Wage a war on Hamas also? Like, I don't know how this works or how this is supposed to work. Or what are they going to use Israel as a cudgel? They say, well, Israel is going to keep bombing and killing until you give up your weapons. Is that what they're going to do?
Yeah.
I don't know how they.
Will Israel even allow them to go in? I mean, I don't even know that Israel will allow that.
Yeah.
It doesn't want Arab and Muslim troops in the Gaza Strip. It wants the Gaza Strip for itself. So I don't even know if that's going to be a hurdle that Trump will ultimately overcome. Israeli opposition to any foreign military presence in the Gaza Strip. So, this seems to me to be just a recipe for more suffering and disaster at the end of the day. I also want to add one other thing. Sorry, Jamal.
No, please.
Although I do believe that all peoples of the world need to apply pressure on their governments to respect international law and to enforce international law in all circumstances. I've given up on the United Nations. For me, the United Nations is completely discredited. I was already on the verge of giving up on them, sort of morally and politically, and advocating for, the United States as an institution for what it matters. My voice is just one of many. But no, I'm done with the United Nations. That is a completely discredited, illegitimate, fatally flawed organization. And the flaws of the United Nations start at the top. And we need to get rid of the idea that any state should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council and no state should have a veto. The United Nations needs to be democratized, and it needs to be given an effective enforcement mechanism that reflects the will of humanity, not of individual governments, but of humanity as a collectivity. And until we have that kind of an organization at the apex of international law and the international legal order, we're going to see a lot more injustice and suffering and lawlessness in this world. The United Nations is a failure.
Dimitri, you're sounding more like me. I make the point of saying there's no such thing as international law because there is no Leviathan over other nations. And I don't know how you do that again if you have one hegemon, how does anything that the UN passes matters? Like the hegemon can do whatever it wants for all intents and purposes. And yeah, you may say economic thing, but for all intents and purposes, the US has just did a trade war against the world on its own, for God's sake. And you might have had one or two other countries that tell it to F off, but for all intents and purposes, many countries knuckled under, even if it's just for the short period of time, even if it's just to give Donald Trump this idea of, okay, daddy, until Donald Trump leaves office. They still played that role. And so that is it sounds like what you're calling for is a world government of sorts, because that's what it would almost take.
No, I had a friend a lawyer friend back in the early days of my career who did a master's degree at Harvard, and he had this, he wrote this thesis about, in which he explained this idea of concentric circles of sovereignty. And he said, there's sovereignty exists in many realms, and the way to deal with, in that case, his article was about Canada. He came from Quebec, and he was concerned about how do you divide powers between the people of Quebec, who believe themselves to be a separate nation, the federal government of Canada. But in principle, this, I think, applies also to international relations. Some aspects of sovereignty need to be ceded to an international organization, and limited aspects of sovereignty. Okay, for most powers would be vested in national governments and their subunits in a properly constructed international legal order. You don't give up all of your sovereignty. You don't even give up most of your sovereignty, but you do have to give up some sovereignty in order for there to be an international peace, and the kinds of order and stability that we require in order to have international commerce and respect for human rights. You have to. And that's precisely what all of these treaties were supposed to be. The Genocide Convention, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the treaty against the prohibition, the treaty on the prohibition against nuclear weapons. All of these things are limitations on the national sovereignty of states, which these states in theory were consensually agreeing to accept for the good of all peoples, including their own. But at the same time, they can retain a very large degree of national sovereignty. This is not new. It's not me. I'm not coming up with this. Not a radical idea that I came up with. This was the whole notion. This was supposed to be the fundamental, concept of the post-World War II international legal order. But it turned out to be a fraud. And all I'm saying is we need to make it a reality. And the United Nations is not going to achieve that goal. It is fatally flawed in its structure. That's it. That's all I'm saying.
No, I accept that. I guess my thing is, how do you do that? Like, is Russia, China, India, America, like any country that has the capability of meaning, I guess, for example, consent is the issue, right? Like, I can centrally agree, but I don't, I can't bomb a government building, even if I want to. It's not about me consenting to not bomb a government building. I will get beaten, potentially killed, and at the very least thrown into a cage for doing so. Who's going to do that on the international stage for any of these world actors that have nukes, or any of these world actors that have the capability of selling the rest of the world to F off? It's that part that I don't quite get. Like, I don't know how you restrain countries when they get to that level, into that status. If you are Malaysia, for example, or if you are Indonesia, if you are, let's say, a smaller country, Timbuktu, then yeah, you would want to be a part of that international order because that's protection for you. That's like you being protected under the law for weakness on some level. I just don't know how you do that with the larger countries. And I don't see any of these countries ceding that level of power and that level of responsibility to, let's say, a United Nations or to any kind of body. That's the crux of the issue to me.
Yeah.
I mean, but tell me if I'm wrong on this. Maybe I'm missing something.
You're 100% right. The governments that are currently in power will not cede that authority to an international body, to anybody else. And the best answer that I can give you, Jamal, is that reform begins at the bottom. The reform needs to happen at the top, but we need to force it as people from the ground up. And that means we have to empower different people. But there's a whole bunch of reasons why we need to do that anyways. Look at what's happening to the world, man. Whatever you may think of the United Nations and the flaws of the structure of the United Nations, we're in serious trouble. We're in deep trouble as a species. And we're on the verge of nuclear annihilation. All indications are that it's going to get worse, not better, the risk of nuclear annihilation. So the very first thing I think that we as peoples must demand is nuclear disarmament. And this is not a radical idea. Again, this is, even Ronald Reagan was convinced of the need to disarm, to at least vastly reduce nuclear arsenals and ultimately eliminate them altogether. And there were, as I mentioned, one of those treaties that were entered into recently, the prohibition on nuclear weapons. By the way, in Canada, where I am, Justin Trudeau disgracefully refused to sign on, even though we aren't. We don't have nuclear weapons, don't aspire to have them in Canada, because of pressure from the United States government. They didn't want this treaty to be legitimized. So whatever. But the point here is that I think the first step is that we need to demand from our elected officials nuclear disarmament. Okay, so the people don't have that kind of destructive capacity at their disposal. That poses an insuperable obstacle to the kinds of international legal reforms that I'm talking about. And then the next step is to actually empower people, elect governments that are committed to a fundamental reform of the United Nations. But the current governments, I agree completely. It's a pipe dream that these people are going to do either of those things.
I think I agree with your first premise. We start at the bottom, but I think for me, starting at the bottom means it all falls apart first. Because if you think about it, the order that was created after the Second World War only happened because of the Second World War. It didn't happen because things were great, or it didn't happen because things were going well. It happened because everything fell apart. And my fear and my strong belief is it happens when everything falls apart, providing there's a humanity left on this planet that can cobble together the pieces. I hope I'm wrong on that. God knows I hope I'm wrong. But
I agree with you. That I think is ultimately how this is going to play out. And the question is whether we're going to survive that collapse.
Yeah. I was reading through or what is it called? The UN passes resolution. So what is it called? COGAT. And I'll just read this part. This is drop site news. It says, with today's passage of the US-led resolution, oversight of aid entering Gaza moves from Israel's COGAT to the United States aligned Board of Peace. I hate that name. God, I hate the propaganda associated with this. And the states participating in it. The decision marks the first major structural change to Gaza's access regime since Israel seized control of the territory in 1967. And it says, under the resolution, the Board of Peace becomes the central gatekeeper for all humanitarian aid. The text makes clear the board oversees, quote, full resumption of humanitarian aid, unquote. All aid must enter Gaza, quote, in cooperation of the BOP, unquote. The operational entities under the BOP handle delivery, distribution, public services, humanitarian assistance. These bodies operate under an international legal personality controlled by the BOP. I guess that's Tony Blair and Donald Trump. It said the resolution also authorizes the BOP to create agencies with authority over movement of people and goods. It says paragraph 4 empowers them to, quote, take any measure to facilitate the movement of persons in and out of Gaza, unquote, which includes convoys and border procedures. This is a lot of legal rhetoric. And this idea of any measure to facilitate the movement of persons in and out of Gaza, that could go dark quick, right? I mean, that could be people who shuffle off to other prisons. That could be, let me ask you this. Is there any value in this moving over from Israel into this kind of new governing board that would allow humanitarian aid to come into the country? Or yes or no on this?
That's the key question, Jamal, and I don't see any meaningful difference. I mean, Trump is going to be in charge, or whoever the U.S. president is, of this so-called Board of Peace. And the U.S. government effectively is in charge of Israel. I mean, who are we kidding here, man? Israel is a giant U.S. military base masquerading as a country. I've said this over and over again. And it does precisely what maybe not precisely, maybe sometimes it departs marginally from directives from Washington. But essentially, and as you know, Lawrence Wilkerson has said, somebody who's high inside the U.S. government for years, it's America's attack dog in the Middle East. So nominally, I mean, in a sense, this arrangement, if it is actually implemented, is going to be more honest in the sense that the people who are actually running the show in occupied Palestine, the U.S. government, will be formally in charge of these things, including the delivery of humanitarian aid. They were always in charge. They always had the ability to force Israel to give the Palestinians sufficient humanitarian aid, or to direct them to restrict the amount of aid going in, to suffocate the population, the civilian population of Gaza. We should assume, rational people assume, that everything Israel has been doing over the last 2 years has been done with the full consent and agreement and facilitation of the United States government. So so now they're pretending, they've stopped pretending that Israel is making these decisions without the consent of the U.S. government. That's all they're doing. But at the end of the day, the people who are ultimately responsible for the genocide are in charge under this resolution, and that's the U.S. government.
Yeah, agreed. What do you make of, I know you've probably been paying attention, maybe, I don't know if it's a flat fact, but what's been taking place in the United States regarding Trump talking about tariffing the world, attacking Venezuela. I get the sense that we're at the beginning of a wag the dog moment. This was actually, they made a movie about this, right? Where the U.S. ends up attacking Canada in order to hide from something else. But in real life, it was in relation to Bill Clinton, that Bill Clinton ends up attacking the Middle East in order to hide from the Monica Lewinsky scandal, effectively wag the dog. You're trying to distract from one thing and doing something else in order to do so. Venezuela seems to be that thing. Donald Trump is mired in the whole Epstein thing here in the United States, with all sorts of emails making it very clear that at the very least, it insinuates that Donald Trump was very close to Epstein, even during his presidency, and that he was perfectly clear about the young girls that Epstein was abusing. I would go so far as to call him a pedophile, but that's a bit strong without direct evidence of it. But fair enough. I'll stand by that. You were friends with this guy for all of these years. You were hanging out with this guy as he was engaging with this abuse. You have all sorts of powerful people that were involved. Obviously, Prince Andrew was involved. You have all sorts of people that were in those emails. And Trump has done any and everything in his power to prevent those emails from coming to light. So now we're seeing this simultaneously with threats against Venezuela, with Trump saying, hey, maybe I'm okay with talking to Maduro. Apparently, there was already conversation between the United States and Venezuela, where Maduro even owned up to the idea of saying, hey, you can get the oil, we'll give you resources, lead me to my devices. And Marco Rubio convinced Donald Trump, it is better if we just take Venezuela. This seems to be another quagmire that the United States is about to get involved in. It's failed with Iran, it's failed with Russia, it's failed with China, and now it seems to be beaten back into this kind of Monroe Doctrine 2.0, where, oh, by the way, failed with Yemen, a much smaller power, by the way. And now it's gone after Venezuela. What do you make of this?
First of all, let's be clear. Donald Trump, do I know whether Donald Trump actually engaged in pedophilia? No. But he's worse than a pedophile. He's a genocidal mass murderer. Donald Trump has been enabling, facilitating, and directing the mass slaughter of children in Gaza. And there's still open, unambiguous starvation, Jamal. You can't do worse things than this. This man's capable of anything. And that's precisely why we should be very worried about what he's going to do now with those military forces in the Caribbean. And let me just talk about, I've been watching in amazement what's going on in the public discourse over the release of these Epstein files. And I think there's a full-blown collapse, not only in support for Israel unfolding before our very eyes in the United States, but there's a full-blown collapse in support for Donald Trump. And his approval rating, I think, is now lower than it has been at any point in his presidency.
Yes.
And it's going to get worse as this information comes out. I think, it's quite clear that the reason why he did this U-turn and said, okay, the Republicans in Congress should vote for the release of the Epstein files, because he knew he was going to lose. And so rather than suffer the humiliation of losing after putting so much pressure on Republicans to vote against it, he wanted to be seen to be in agreement with it. But when that stuff comes out, if in fact they release, they do what the resolution apparently calls for, which is the mass release of all the Epstein files, I can only imagine things are going to get much worse for him in the public discourse, and he's going to be tempted to do something like this. And I think, what is he going to do with those military forces in the Caribbean if not use them? But at the same time, he's in a very, very, I think, difficult spot if he's thinking at all rationally, which is doubtful. 15,000 troops and a bunch of naval, assets aren't going to remove the government of Venezuela and replace it with whatever Donald Trump wants to be in charge. That is not likely to happen. I understand from, some U.S. military experts, independent of the government, who have been talking about this, that Venezuela actually has the capacity to sink some of those vessels. Can you imagine if they sink a destroyer or, the USS Gerald Ford itself? I mean, the United States will be utterly discredited as a military power. It already, its military, prowess and capabilities are in question because of the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. They couldn't even, with the whole of NATO backing the United States, the whole of NATO in 20 years was not able to defeat the Taliban. And now they're having their asses handed to them by the Russians. The, Ansar Allah put an ass kicking on the U.S. Navy, the most powerful Navy in the world, in the Red Sea. And if they attempt some kind of aggression, open and direct aggression against Venezuela, and they end up losing some, in a very visible manner, key naval assets, I think the United States will be completely discredited as a military power, and Trump will be in an even worse position than he is now. So I don't know what he's going to do. I wouldn't be surprised if this is all bluff at the end of the day, but is there a risk that this man is going to try to engage in some kind of distraction? Absolutely. Absolutely there is. And it turn out to be a real disaster for the American people, not just for the Venezuelan people.
Yeah, it's funny. Cixin Liu, in his book Three Body Problem, and I think it was the Dark Forest one, when they were talking about, there's always this talk about how the Simpsons are prophetic because The Simpsons continuously get stuff right. Like 20 years later, they nail it for some reason. I don't know how they do it. It's like Trump 2024 or something like that, and they nail it. They nail that stuff. Cixin Liu, in his book, he had this part about Venezuela and about how the U.S. attacked Venezuela. And as you're reading, you're like, what? The U.S. attacked Venezuela? What the hell is he talking about? And here we are. Right? But the U.S. seems to be on the verge of doing just that. And you're like, wow, it's amazing how some of this stuff, how it hits, like how they nail it. By the way, we got our ass kicked in that war, in the book, where the U.S. Got beaten by the guy in Venezuela, where they effectively pulled back, allowed the military to come back in, and effectively ran a guerrilla war that destroyed the U.S. military in Venezuela. Hopefully that doesn't come about. And we don't know what the Russians have dumped in Venezuela. I mean, the Russians have signed a strategic agreement with Venezuela. There were all sorts of ships, or let's say planes, that were dropping off military hardware or equipment. We don't know what that equipment is. The Russians haven't necessarily been open about it. You've had some Russian leaders who was like, hey, we shouldn't leave our allies behind. We have to defend allies. And obviously, Russia, China, and Iran has been somewhat close to Venezuela. And maybe that is the thought behind this also, that these other countries are now in our backyard, creating this kind of Cuban-esque crisis in the way that they look at it. Mm-hmm. Give me a take on that. Or you don't see that as being the primary reason or justification for it? Or maybe there are multiple reasons for it.
Oh, I think they would have, the United States government would have wanted, I shouldn't say the government, Trump would have wanted to engage in whatever military force they deem necessary to remove Maduro from power and install a U.S. puppet, because Venezuela has the largest oil resources in the world. That would have been, a temptation that Trump couldn't resist, whether or not the Russians are in there. If the Russians have been, in fact, delivering, air defense systems, offensive strike capability, missile strike capability, drones, whatever, I mean, this is just a even bigger recipe for disaster. But I don't think it's because the Russians are in there or the Chinese are in there. And apparently the Chinese are the largest foreign investor in Venezuela nowadays.
Yes.
That's not the primary motivation, I would think. I think the primary motivation is the oil.
Basically, get the energy.
And Trump is, not particularly, minded to hide that fact. He openly covets the oil resources of other countries.
Yeah.
But 15,000 soldiers and a bunch of missiles, is that going to, Venezuela is a huge country. It's a very difficult terrain to operate in. As I mentioned, I think previously, Jamal, I've been there a couple of times and seen that there are a lot of people in that country who are committed to Chavismo. They may, even if they're not necessarily huge fans of Nicolas Maduro, and they're very committed to their sovereignty, and they will do whatever, many of them will do whatever it takes to expel an invader and an occupier. And this could get real ugly really fast for the United States government. And I can't, none of us should rule out the possibility that Trump will just engage in an open, naked aggression against Venezuela in the days ahead.
Agreed. One last issue before I let you go. Al-Jilani, Al-Shara, whatever he wants to call himself, was in Washington having a conversation with some of the military personnel that was there. Secretary of War, Hegseth, like God of War, like that. It's more honest, so I accept it. I've always said that we should rename it, or we should go back to the old name, Department of War. But it's still kind of cartoonish. Either way, what do you think he was there for? What was the, like, why is he there having a conversation with the various military personnel in the United States?
I think that Trump wants to see Syria normalize with Israel, is my guess, and would like very much to see this, this so-called president, or whatever they call him nowadays, of the new Syrian nation to legitimize Israel's theft of Syrian land. The Trump administration, the first time around, was the first major government in the world to recognize Israel's illegal annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. And it remains an outlier in that regard. The vast majority of states say that, and they're right, but that is a violation of international law, Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. So I think he wants to see the Syrian government, the so-called Syrian government itself, legitimize the acquisition of that land. I think he wants to see any military threat within Syria negated, so that Israeli planes can effectively operate over the skies of Syria and American planes without any impediment. That opens up a route of attack against Iran. Syria does have some resources that American corporations covet. I'm sure that's part of it. But I think the overall objective is probably to see so-called normalization, which really what that means is subjugation to the United States government and its attack dog in the region. That's what normalization actually means. And that's what they want from Syria.
Now, he's been in Moscow. Apparently, representatives have gone to China.
Yeah.
What is this? Like trying to balance multiple forces for his own survival?
I don't know. I'm befuddled by this, this cozy relationship between al-Jawlani and the Russian government. I mean, I can understand why. I think it's consistent with the way the Russian government has operated for many years. So for example, there's these images that we've all seen of Vladimir Putin high-fiving with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, as though they're the closest of chums. And the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is no better than Jawlani. He's just got much more power at his disposal, but the man is a ruthless mass murderer. For Christ's sakes. I mean, they were effectively committing a genocide in Yemen for years with the full support of Washington and other Western governments. So it doesn't surprise me to see Russia dealing with al-Jawlani, because as a practical matter, for the time being, he is in charge, at least of Damascus. But what kind of dealing are they doing? Because, the United States is driving the bus on this. So why would the United States tolerate given its overall attitude towards Russia, why would it tolerate close relations between and some form of coordination between al-Jawlani and the Russian government? I don't know. I really, it befuddles me that the United States is even tolerating this.
Agreed. It confused me too. That's what I'm asking. It's confusing to me. I don't quite get it. Dimitri, you are awesome, man. You've been doing damn good work. Keep it up. Like I said, I've been binging your show for the last several weeks. You've been doing a fantastic job. Reason to Resist, that's Dimitri's channel on YouTube. Dimitri is, let me get the first part right. He is a lawyer, journalist, activist from Montreal, Quebec. Thank you for this, man. You be safe.